The air in the Italian Alps, high above the valleys, was thin, crisp with the bite of the winter winds that howled between jagged peaks. It was the morning of December 18th, 1943. The sun had just risen, casting long shadows across the snow-covered slopes. In the distance, a column of German soldiers trudged wearily, their boots heavy with the weight of the journey ahead. They could not have known it, but they were walking into an inescapable trap. The mountains, once thought impassable, had become the unlikely battleground for one of the most elusive and deadly guerrilla forces the Wehrmacht would ever encounter. For the German soldiers, it was supposed to be just another routine patrol through the rugged terrain of northern Italy. Yet, as they moved deeper into the mountain pass, the oppressive silence grew heavier. The sound of the wind, the crunch of snow beneath their feet, became a constant reminder of the harsh environment they were in. But it wasn't the environment that posed the greatest threat. It was the enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, yet were closing in on them with every step. Unbeknownst to the German patrols, the Italian partisans had already made their mark in the mountains. The rugged hills and steep slopes were their domain, the perfect place for a resistance force to operate under the cover of nature's unforgiving landscape. Since the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini fell in September 1943, Italy was thrown into chaos. The Italian Social Republic, a puppet state of Nazi Germany, controlled much of the country, and the Wehrmacht moved to suppress any resistance with brutal force. But the mountains, as well as the dense forests and narrow valleys, gave the partisans an advantage that the German military could not comprehend. In these remote locations, the German soldiers' superior numbers and heavy artillery were useless. Here, it was the will of the people, armed with little more than small arms, explosives, and sheer determination that would turn the tide. By the winter of 1943, the Italian partisans had begun to understand the terrain in a way the Germans never could. They moved swiftly, silently, as shadows, using the mountains' labyrinthine paths to their advantage. The German military, despite its dominance in conventional warfare, struggled to combat this new, unconventional enemy. The Wehrmacht, trained for open field battles, found itself ensnared in a war of attrition, where every ridge and every boulder could conceal a partisan ambush. It was a war of movement, a war of stealth, and the Germans were becoming increasingly desperate. The Wehrmacht's response was to send larger, more heavily equipped divisions into the mountains. They underestimated the power of the local resistance and its ability to blend into the environment. The partisans knew the mountains intimately, while the German forces, with their bulky trucks, armored vehicles, and clumsy formations, were hampered by the terrain. In late December 1943, the Germans attempted to send a column of reinforcements through a narrow pass near the town of Fenestrelle. The partisans, led by local commanders who had fought for their homes and families, were waiting. Hidden behind the natural rock formations, they waited for the right moment to strike. As the Germans marched into the pass, they were caught off guard by a series of well-coordinated explosions, designed not to kill, but to disrupt and confuse. The German soldiers were scattered, their lines shattered, their morale crushed by the brutal ambush. And it was only the beginning. For months, the partisans harassed the German forces. These strikes were never decisive in the traditional sense, but they wore down the Wehrmacht's resolve. Every ambush, every delayed supply convoy, every damaged vehicle chipped away at the German confidence in their ability to control the mountainous regions. By the time the winter snow began to melt in the spring of 1944, the partisans had entrenched themselves in the alpine terrain like never before. They had begun to trap entire divisions, using the natural geography to herd their enemies into tight, enclosed spaces, where they could strike with devastating effect. This war in the mountains was not only about military tactics, it was about the psychology of warfare. The Wehrmacht, already stretched thin across Europe, found its forces pinned down by a series of relentless, low-intensity engagements that sapped their strength. The German soldiers were trapped in a constant cycle of anxiety, never knowing where or when the next attack would come. Every patrol became a high-stakes gamble. German command, constantly playing catch-up, failed to understand how the partisans' knowledge of the terrain gave them the upper hand. The nature of the terrain, combined with the resilience of the local people, made the Italian Alps an unyielding fortress for the resistance. It was in these very mountains that the seeds of the Allies' eventual victory in Italy were sown. The partisans, armed with nothing but the knowledge of their land and the will to fight, began to shift the balance of power. The German attempt to suppress the resistance with brutal force, mass executions, forced labor, and scorched earth tactics only fueled the partisans' resolve. The harshness of the German reprisals created an even more determined opposition. The more the Germans pushed into the mountains, the more the partisans adapted, using guerrilla tactics to inflict constant losses. As the war dragged on, the mountain battlegrounds became a symbol of defiance. A symbol that, despite overwhelming odds, ordinary men and women could stand up against the might of the Wehrmacht. By the summer of 1944, the German command had no choice but to divert precious resources away from their primary operations on the front lines to deal with the increasingly effective partisan forces in the mountains. They had underestimated the determination of the local populations, who saw the resistance as their only hope for liberation from fascism. The Wehrmacht, once an unchallenged force in Europe, now faced the impossible, a highly mobile, deeply entrenched enemy, operating in an environment they could neither understand nor control. As the winter of 1944 approached, the battle for the mountains intensified. The Italian partisans, having fought off the Germans for over a year, had transformed from a fragmented group of resistance fighters into a well-coordinated and effective force. The mountains had become their domain, and the German soldiers who had once been masters of Europe were now reduced to mere pawns on a chessboard they could not hope to control. What began as small, desperate attacks had evolved into a sustained campaign that left entire German divisions trapped, demoralized, and vulnerable. The tide was turning, but the question remained: how had this ragtag army of resistance fighters, armed with little more than the determination of their cause, come to trap entire divisions of one of the most formidable armies in the world? The answer lay not in the technology of war, but in the deep connection the partisans had with the land they fought for. The terrain of the Italian Alps was not just a backdrop to the battle, it was a weapon in its own right. And as the German forces discovered, it was a weapon that would cost them dearly. In the winter of 1944, the Germans were still grappling with the reality of their failed efforts to quell the Italian resistance in the mountains. It was clear now that the mountainous terrain of northern Italy had become more than just a physical barrier. It had become a graveyard for entire divisions of the Wehrmacht. But the German response remained predictable: reinforcements and more aggressive tactics. They could not fathom the resilience of the resistance, or the power of the terrain that had turned against them. The mountains had become a sanctuary for the Italian partisans, a place where they could not only survive, but strike with terrifying efficiency. The key to the partisans' success lay in their understanding of the terrain. For the German soldiers, navigating the labyrinthine paths of the Alps was a struggle. The steep, snow-covered slopes, the narrow mountain passes, and the sheer inaccessibility of many areas were not obstacles to the partisans. They were advantages. Using the dense forests and isolated villages as bases of operations, the resistance fighters created an intricate network of hiding spots, supply routes, and escape paths. This web of concealment allowed them to launch lightning-fast attacks that left the Germans in disarray. One of the most significant factors that allowed the partisans to continue fighting from the mountains was their use of local knowledge. Unlike the Germans, who relied on bulky vehicles and standard military tactics, the resistance knew how to move undetected, how to disappear into the landscape, and how to strike with precision. It was no longer just a matter of attacking. It was about creating a constantly shifting, unpredictable enemy. The partisans became ghosts in the mountains, appearing only when they chose to. It was this ability to vanish and reappear at will that kept the Germans on edge. The technical capabilities of the resistance were modest at best. They had no heavy artillery, no tanks to back them up. But what they had was a deep understanding of the terrain, an unyielding resolve, and the ability to make the most of whatever resources they could scrounge together. It wasn't just about guerrilla tactics anymore. It was about creating an environment in which the Germans could not function. The partisans would ambush supply convoys, disrupt German communications, and sabotage infrastructure, all while melting back into the mountains before the Germans could retaliate. It was a constant battle of attrition. The Germans, unable to maintain a foothold in the mountains, sent in their elite mountain divisions, the Gebirgsjäger, known for their expertise in alpine warfare. These soldiers, trained to fight in the harsh conditions of the Alps, were the Wehrmacht's response to the partisans' unrelenting pressure. However, the Gebirgsjäger were not prepared for the enemy they were facing. The partisans, armed with nothing more than small arms and explosives, turned the rugged terrain into their own fortress. The Gebirgsjäger were well trained, but the partisans were better suited to the mountains. They used the landscape to funnel the Germans into narrow valleys, where ambushes could be set up with devastating precision. The Germans, in turn, grew more desperate. As entire units were trapped or isolated by the partisan attacks, the Wehrmacht began to escalate its response. Brutal reprisals against civilians, the burning of villages, and the systematic destruction of anything that might aid the resistance became commonplace. Yet these actions only served to strengthen the resolve of the partisans. Every civilian death, every burnt village was a rallying cry. The mountains, once a symbol of isolation, became a symbol of resistance. As the spring thawed the snow and the warm winds of summer swept across the Italian countryside, the partisan forces began to expand their control. By the middle of 1944, the situation had reached a tipping point. The partisan movement was no longer a collection of scattered cells. They were now a coordinated army, operating under a unified command structure, complete with supply lines, communication networks, and even makeshift hospitals. They were not just surviving in the mountains, they were thriving. The Germans had underestimated the depth of the partisan network and the degree to which local populations had embraced the resistance. The mountains were no longer just a place of hiding. They were the epicenter of a growing insurgency. One of the most effective tools in the partisans' arsenal was their ability to control the flow of information. The Germans, reliant on radios and telephone lines, were constantly vulnerable to sabotage. The resistance intercepted German communications, spread disinformation, and kept the Wehrmacht in a state of confusion. Every move the Germans made was met with a counter-move from the partisans. The Germans, unable to predict the next strike, were left in a state of constant paranoia. By now, the partisans had learned the art of warfare in the mountains. Their ambushes were more sophisticated, their attacks more coordinated. They knew when to strike hard and when to melt away. Their confidence was growing, and the Germans began to realize that this was no longer a small-scale insurgency. They were facing a well-organized force that was using the mountains to its advantage. And yet, despite the growing effectiveness of the partisans, the German response remained unchanged. They continued to throw more troops into the mountains, hoping that sheer force would eventually crush the resistance. The most significant breakthrough for the partisans came in July 1944. After months of harassing the Germans, the resistance orchestrated a massive ambush near the town of Val di Susa. It was a turning point in the mountain war. The partisans, using their knowledge of the terrain and their superior mobility, trapped a full German division. The ambush was meticulously planned. The division, moving through a narrow mountain pass, found itself suddenly surrounded. There was no way out. The mountain passes, which had once served as corridors for the Germans to move their troops, were now their tombs. The Germans, caught in a vice, were forced to surrender or fight to the last man. The partisan victory was a testament to their strategy, their unity, and their ability to exploit the terrain to its fullest. This victory, though significant, was only one of many in a campaign that would last until the end of the war. The partisans, despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, had demonstrated the power of unconventional warfare. By trapping entire divisions, by using the mountains as a weapon, they had forced the Germans to rethink their strategy. The Wehrmacht's arrogance, their belief in their superiority, had led them to underestimate the resolve and ingenuity of the Italian people. The mountains, once considered an impediment, had become the very thing that would spell the end for German control over northern Italy. The Wehrmacht had entered the mountains expecting to crush the resistance. Instead, they were the ones who were crushed. By the summer of 1944, the German forces in Italy were stretched thin. The mountains had become a critical battleground, one where the Wehrmacht could no longer rely solely on their superior technology or large-scale conventional tactics. The Italian partisans, once a scattered and fragmented group, had evolved into a formidable and well-organized resistance force. The Germans, frustrated and demoralized, were beginning to recognize the harsh truth. The mountains were no longer theirs to control. The partisan victory at Val di Susa was a watershed moment. It wasn't just about the loss of men or equipment for the Germans. It was about the psychological toll. A once imposing force, the Wehrmacht was now reeling from the relentless harassment of a much smaller, far more agile enemy. The operation to crush the Italian resistance had been a failure, and the Germans were beginning to realize that every day they spent in the mountains, every battle they fought in these unforgiving heights, was a day lost. They were not making progress. They were being worn down. The partisan forces, however, had only begun to scratch the surface of their potential. What had started as isolated guerrilla groups, fighting for survival, had now become an increasingly effective force. They began to seize more territory, more villages, and more strategic positions. These victories weren't always large-scale. Many were small, tactical strikes, but their cumulative effect was devastating. Entire German divisions found themselves on the back foot, retreating under the weight of constant attacks. The partisans had learned to exploit the terrain in ways that the Germans never could have anticipated. The mountains, with their towering peaks and winding valleys, became a fortress for the resistance, one that the Germans could not penetrate. The German military, desperate to stop the growing partisan threat, responded with ever more brutal measures. The policy of reprisal attacks, already in full swing, escalated in intensity. Villages were razed, civilians were rounded up, and partisan fighters were executed on the spot. But these measures only galvanized the resistance. The partisans were not fighting for a distant political ideology. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their land. Each act of terror perpetrated by the Germans only strengthened their resolve. The brutality of the Wehrmacht turned the mountain villages into rallying points for the resistance, further eroding any hope the Germans had of re-establishing control. In the months that followed, the tide continued to turn in favor of the partisans. By late 1944, the Italian resistance movement had expanded beyond the mountains. The partisans were now coordinating operations across the entire country, acting as a unified force with increasingly sophisticated tactics and communication networks. The Germans were forced to spread their resources thinner and thinner, sending troops into the mountains and into towns, trying to stamp out resistance wherever it appeared. But the more the Germans responded, the more entrenched the partisans became. One of the key elements of the partisans' success was their ability to rally local populations to their cause. The mountains had once isolated communities, but they were now an integral part of the resistance network. The local population had not only grown weary of the fascist regime, but they had also become deeply committed to the struggle against the Germans. As German reprisals intensified, the people of the mountains turned out in greater numbers to support the partisans. Men, women, and children helped carry supplies, spread information, and even took up arms. The partisans were no longer just fighters. They were part of a broader movement that had touched the lives of everyone in the mountains. But the Germans had not given up hope. In early 1945, they launched a final, all-out attempt to break the resistance in the mountains. The operation, known as the Battle of the Alps, was designed to crush the partisans once and for all. They poured men, artillery, and tanks into the mountainous regions, hoping to end the war in Italy with a decisive victory. What the Germans didn't realize was that the partisans had evolved far beyond the tactics they had used in 1943 and 1944. They had adapted, they had learned, and they were ready. The Battle of the Alps began in early January 1945, with the Germans pushing deeper into the mountains. The partisans, however, were ready for them. Using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, they launched a series of hit-and-run attacks on the German supply lines, cutting off their reinforcements and weakening their ability to sustain the assault. The Germans, trapped in the narrow valleys, found themselves under constant attack from all directions. The mountain terrain, once a place of confusion and chaos for the partisans, had become their advantage. The Germans, burdened by their heavy equipment and unfamiliar with the terrain, were unable to fight effectively. For the next several weeks, the partisans continued to hold their ground. Their knowledge of the mountains, combined with their newfound unity, allowed them to outmaneuver the Germans at every turn. By mid-February, the Battle of the Alps was effectively over. The German forces had suffered heavy casualties and were forced to retreat from the mountains, leaving the partisans in control. It was one of the final blows to German power in Italy. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was immense. The Germans, who had once believed that their military prowess could conquer any terrain, now found themselves defeated by a group of determined, resourceful guerrilla fighters. The mountains had become the graveyard of German ambition. The ability of the partisans to not only survive but to thrive in the harsh conditions of the Italian Alps had dealt a devastating blow to the German war effort. And it would be in these very mountains that the final chapters of the Italian campaign would be written, not by the Wehrmacht, but by the men and women who had turned the terrain into their ultimate weapon. As the war in Italy wound down, the legacy of the partisan fighters in the mountains was cemented. They had proven that victory did not come from the size of the army, nor from the most advanced technology. It came from the will to fight, the knowledge of the land, and the unyielding belief in the cause. For the German forces, the defeat in the mountains was not just a tactical failure, it was a humiliation. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered by the very people they had sought to subjugate. The mountains of northern Italy had become a symbol of resistance, a testament to the power of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The partisans, once seen as a minor nuisance by the Germans, had become the key to Italy's liberation. And in the mountains, they had trapped the very forces that had once seemed invincible. It was a victory that would echo through history. A reminder that no matter how powerful an enemy may be, there is always a way to fight back. The mountains had claimed their price. The Wehrmacht, despite their might, had been defeated by the land itself, and the people who knew it better than anyone else. The mountains were no longer just a geographical feature. They had become the heart of the resistance, a sanctuary for those who would not surrender. The trap had been set, and the Wehrmacht had walked right into it. The question now was whether they would ever be able to escape. This was the story of how a small, determined group of partisans turned the Italian Alps into a symbol of resistance. A story of courage, strategy, and defiance. A story that would resonate for generations to come. The mountains had claimed their victory, and the Wehrmacht finally was caught.